The most important thing to remember when presenting a plan is that it's not a question of getting it right the first time. The purpose of presenting a plan is to give those around you an opportunity to listen to it, to think about the logic that it represents, and to make suggestions. I'm going to give you my plan for how I would put together a stakeholder committee in this company. While I am describing this, I would like you to think about whether or not I am missing anything, and I would like you to think about the questions that you would ask once I was finished. What I would do is to have an HR representative head the committee. I wouldn't put anyone there in charge. I would simply have someone from the HR department responsible for managing the process and communication. The reason that I would do this is that I would have policies and procedures have a home in the HR department. And so if they are going to be the caretakers of these policies, they might as well be the caretakers of the committee that develops them. In the second step, I would have the HR rep invite volunteers from the company. I believe it is very important that volunteers are asked rather than people being nominated. I would ask the HR rep to very simply ask for those that are interested, and if there are more people than are required for any given department, to simply hold a lottery so that people are chosen randomly. Now, this is a very specific approach. It assumes that every stakeholder, HR department, supervisors, and employees in this company has a valid view and a valid opinion. Again, in theory, that will help ensure that the policies represent the average employee and that they also represent something that the average employee could look at and say, yes, I had a stake in this. Once the HR rep had their manageable committee, I would have that person lay out 5 steps. However often it took to meet as a committee, I would have them, number 1, discuss the current state for the company. What are we doing? What are our expectations? How well are those expectations communicated? And also, what implicit rules are we imposing on our employees? Is there anything, and there usually is, that we expect our employees to be doing that isn't written down? Once we understood the current state, then I would ask the committee to review the existing policies that are in place, what they are, what their purpose is, and how important they are. I would then ask them to identify gaps. What are we not doing that we should be? What expectations are we expecting that we're not being clear on? What is it that we should be doing that would make it better for our employees? Once gaps were identified, then I would ask the committee to develop policies to address those gaps. And lastly, I would have a communication program and an information session program to be able to roll out this new policy book to the rest of the company. And the last part of this question, how will you know if you did the right thing? Here's the question I would like you to think about for a moment. Let's assume that this process of developing this representative stakeholder committee was successful and we had a full rollout of what was generally agreed to be a good policy book. I'd like you to think ahead and tell me, what does success look like? One way to evaluate whether or not a plan worked is to develop some types of measures. So that's what I'm going to do. Let's assume that these policies worked and that they ended up making a better environment for employees to work in. I would expect 2 things to happen. I would expect that there would be fewer problems that supervisors had with employees because more expectations were explicit. I would expect that to show up in fewer contacts between supervisors and the HR department for anything that had to do with employee conduct. So the number of calls between supervisors and HR to help with employee problems, I would expect would drop. I would also expect employee satisfaction ratings of the company to increase. I don't know how far they would increase, but I would expect an increase after a policy announcement where all of the expectations for an employee were made explicit and all those recommendations came from the employees themselves. What I would like you to do is ask yourself now, would those measures sufficiently capture success, or is something missing? If something is missing, I would like you to write out what you would add or do differently in terms of understanding how you would know if this previous plan was successful.